Everyone, and welcome to the first in a series of 6 webinars that we are running at Surviving Economic Abuse with funding from both the Home Office and the Comic Relief. We're so pleased to welcome you here. There's 360 of you, so I imagine there's going to be lots of questions as the webinar continues, so please do share those questions in the chat as we go along. Today's topic is on coerced debt. I am the founder and chief executive of Surviving Economic Abuse. My name is Nicole Jacobs, and I'm going to be chairing the event today. I'd also like to thank Becky on the Surviving Economic Abuse team, who is supporting us with the tech, and we'll be asking her to move the slides as we go through today. So if we can move to the next slide, please, Becky. So I'm particularly excited about today's seminar, in as much as it also marks the launch of the Economic Justice Project Evaluation Report. And the Economic Justice Project was the charity's founding project back in 2017. So the launch of the report today marks 3 years of really hard work by the team at Surviving Economic Abuse and our partners, Money Advice Plus, who became very involved with this project at the beginning. So today's seminar is all about coerced debt. As I said, you'll be hearing from a survivor of coerced debt, our partners Money Advice Plus. We'll also be talking to partners StepChange, and we'll also be talking about some of the work that we're doing at the local level around this issue. I'm also really excited to announce that the Designate Domestic Abuse Commissioner, Nicole Jacobs, has agreed to watch today's webinar, and she's going to be sharing some reflections about it at the end. She's been a huge supporter of this piece of project from its inception, so we're really excited by that. So I can introduce the speakers to you on the next slide, please. So you'll be hearing from Rebecca, who's a member of Surviving Economic Abuse's Expert by Experience group, and as I said, is a survivor of coerced debt. And we work with over 100 victims and survivors at Surviving Economic Abuse through the Experts by Experience group, and they very much inform everything that we do. You'll be hearing from Karen Perrier, who's the Chief Exec of Money Advice Plus. We must offer our congratulations to Karen because that's a new appointment and that's really exciting for her. And Jeanette Hope, who is a money advisor at Money Advice Plus. We'll also be hearing from Helen Hansel, who's the Relation Manager at StepChange, and Judy Barber, who is the Debt and Benefit Specialist and is jointly employed by Surviving Economic Abuse and Money Advice Plus. And as I said, we're really excited also to be hearing from Nicole today. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So before we kick off today, I do want to address the importance of looking after your well-being as part of this webinar. There is a chat function and you can message the moderator privately. So if you feel like you need to reach out for any support at any stage during today's webinar, please do that. You will also be able to refer to the resources page on CEE's website as well, and there'll be details about that at the end of today's webinar. Please be aware that we will be using real life examples and case studies, which can be upsetting. And also you might not necessarily understand economic abuse and coerced debt specifically in the way that we do. And sometimes listening to a webinar like this can sometimes remind people of past experiences or certainly experiences of family and friends. So as we said, it's really important that you exercise self-care. So if you feel like you need to leave the meeting, please do so. If you feel you're in an environment where you prefer that this isn't overheard, then I just suggest now perhaps moving your laptop somewhere else, popping in some headphones and creating some privacy for yourself. Again, if we could move to the next slide, please, Becky. So before I introduce Rebecca as the first speaker this morning, I just want to introduce you to the work of Surviving Economic Abuse for those who don't know us. We were launched in 2017 and our mission is to raise awareness of economic abuse, to really shine a light on this under-recognised area, and we seek to transform responses to it. And the reason why we do this work in partnership with others is because we want women to be able to access economic resources, to be in control of their own economic resources, to be economically stable, and to be compensated for any economic harm that they experience. And ultimately, we want women to be economically equal so that they can make the choices that they want to in their lives. So we do this in a number of different ways. Move on to the next slide, please. Thank you, Becky. ranging really from educating communities all the way through to influencing national legislation. So today you'll be hearing very much about our work in relation to improving professional practice, but we'll also be touching on how we change policies and procedures in relation to that. Our national legislation influencing work has been successful to date, in that we were successful in having economic abuse named within the statutory definition of domestic abuse, which has been brought forward by the Domestic Abuse Bill currently going through the House of Lords. And again, as you listen to today's webinar, you'll be aware that economic abuse is a form of abuse, a form of coercive control that can continue post-separation. So we're now asking for an amendment to the Domestic Abuse Bill so that post-separation abuse, including economic abuse, can be recognised within the Serious Crime Act. So if we could just move to the next slide again, Becky, please. As I said at the very beginning, we're really excited to be launching the evaluation report of the Economic Justice Project. We are going to be publishing a blog with a link to that report later today, and we will make sure that everybody receives a link to that blog. Again, if we could move to the next slide, Becky. Before I introduce you to Rebecca, who's going to be able to speak much more powerfully around what coerced debt is, I did want to give you an overview of our understanding of coerced debt. So we do recognise it as a form of economic abuse, and we see it as debt which is generated through financial transactions, which the victim is told to make or learns the abuser is making in their name in a context of coercion and control. So the main point here is that the victim is unable to challenge that safely. They are fearful of challenging what's happening. And examples include credit cards, loans, finance agreements, mortgages, lots of different sources of credit, utility bills, and so on and so forth. And I would also like to add that our understanding of coerced debt also recognises debt that's been accrued from a victim being forced into a position where they have to take out credit in order to survive because they don't have access to the economic resources that they need. So that might be clothes from a catalogue, for example, because that's the only way they are able to clothe themselves and their children. If we could just move on to the final slide then, before I hand over to Rebecca, I just wanted to flag the scale of the problem. So these are the headline findings from the Economic Justice Report. Some of you may have heard some of these before because they were covered by BBC News back in September, and we also had a piece in relation to this in the Independent newspaper. But what we do know from the Economic Justice Project is that 95% of domestic abuse victims experience economic abuse, that 60% of economic abuse victims are coerced into debt. So this is happening in 6 out of 10 cases, so it's more likely to be prevalent than not. The average number of creditors per victim is 5, and the average amount of debt per victim is £4,600. Although I have to say, as part of this project, one woman was supported who had debts in excess of £40,000. And it's also really important to flag that close to half of this debt is priority debt. So people are at risk of losing their homes and having their utilities cut off. And collectively, victims are footing an annual bill of around £23.5 million. One of the things that we're calling for off the back of this report is for coerced debt to be recognised in consumer law, because at the moment, consumer law only recognises a relationship between the creditor and the person who takes out that credit. It doesn't recognise undue influence or duress caused by a third party. So it's really important that we have changes to consumer law so that it is recognised within a good framework which we can use to really challenge it. But what we have been doing as part of the project, in which my colleagues will speak to in more detail, is relying on the goodwill of creditors to write that debt off. And I'm really excited to say that certainly now in at least 1 in 4 cases, that is the case. So if we could move to the next slide. As I said, I'd love to introduce you now to Rebecca, who, as I said, is going to be able to talk to this a lot more powerfully than me because of her lived experience. You'll see here a picture of Rebecca on the left, next to somebody else you might well recognise, Prince Charles. I'm delighted to say that Rebecca was awarded a Pride of Britain Award for her work in this area. She's an amazing campaigner around domestic abuse. She supports the charity that supported her. She speaks out about coerced debt in support of the work that we do here at Surviving Economic Abuse. And we are just so proud to work alongside her. So I'd like to pass over to Rebecca now.
Hello. So today I'm going to be talking about my experiences with financial abuse, but before that I will just briefly summarise the relationship. I met my ex-partner when I was 19, and unfortunately he was abusive very early on, and not long into the relationship I discovered I was pregnant. Skipping forward in time, 5 years later, I have a beautiful son, but I've suffered all forms of abuse throughout the relationship, and it was getting worse and more frequent. After a really bad weekend in which I suffered a lot of physical and emotional abuse, I decided that I wanted a better life for myself and my son. So I made the decision to end the relationship. A couple of weeks after ending the relationship, my ex told me he was going to kill me. He came into my home the next night and assaulted me to the point of needing reconstructive surgery. I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, and there were ongoing court proceedings, which meant I was unable to work. But the more I learned about domestic violence, the more I wanted to do to help others and turn my negative into a positive. So I started doing work with charities. I'm now going to talk about the financial abuse throughout the relationship. During the relationship, my ex wasn't proactive in seeking work. My family were not able to help me financially, so money was always tight. Yet my ex seemed to always have money for the things he wanted. And if I were to question him about wasting money on things such as gambling or ask for money towards living expenses, I would be told it was his money. He would sporadically buy me gifts. These gifts would be thrown in my face and used as a tactic. Now, to some, the gifts may seem like a nice gesture, but I was trying to provide for a child, to pay for a home in which we all lived. The responsibility should be shared in any partnership, yet I was made to feel like a nuisance and ungrateful when I would express this. My ex knew the PIN numbers for my bank accounts, and there would be many times I would go to withdraw money and it would be gone. He would take the money without telling me, and when I would ask him about this, he would promise he would pay it back, but never did. He would also make me get things like store cards in my name, spend the money on them, and then would never pay me back. I was constantly chasing my tail with bills, cancelling direct debits to be able to buy food and other things my son needed. One day I was in town with my ex. I had gone into my bank to query some payments. Out of the blue, the woman told me I was eligible for a £6,000 loan. I immediately declined the offer. However, my ex gave me a look. She then said she would give me and my ex a moment to discuss this. The account was in my name. It wasn't a joint account. Yet for some reason, my ex was being given the option to play a part in the decision. When she left us, he forced me to get the loan. I left the bank feeling nervous, but my ex was overjoyed, telling me, "We're rich." Having suffered for so long, part of me thought it was a chance to create some financial stability. Use it wisely and carefully. However, the very day the money went into my account, my ex took £900 to pay off a debt, telling me if he didn't, he would be in trouble. Again, he would promise he would give it back, and of course he didn't. And it spiraled from there. Before I knew it, the money had gone. My ex told me I didn't need to worry about paying it back, that they would write it off after a few years anyway. This is not the case. I would constantly try and encourage my ex to better himself, try to get some qualifications that could in turn offer him a career. My ex had made the decision he wanted to run a bike shop, so he would be always in the garden fixing bikes with friends. Although this was something that could have been a positive for us and as a family, it was just another thing he used to excuse the way he treated me. It was used as a reason he couldn't care for his child, help me around the house, why he couldn't spend time with us, why his friends had to be in our garden constantly doing illegal things that could jeopardize our tenancy. He then set up the business. I said I could be involved with it and it could be a family thing. He didn't want me anywhere near the shop. He would deal drugs from the shop and would deal with stolen bikes. And again, if I dared to confront him about this, there would be consequences. Our gas and electric were on a meter and there would be numerous occasions it would run out. And if I asked him for money, I was told he had the business to focus on. He also had the rent card and had told me he was paying this each week. He wasn't. They contacted me one day to tell me we were £2,000 in arrears. I felt trapped and alone, caring for a child with hardly any money and dealing with the abuse. The physical abuse started to get worse. Even though he was financially abusing me, he had still managed to convince me that I couldn't survive without him. I didn't want money to buy fancy things. I simply wanted to be able to provide the basics for my son. I would look for work myself, but I was so emotionally damaged that I didn't even feel anybody would want to employ me. At that time, you're just surviving. You're not able to even begin to build the foundations for a career. You're trapped in the cycle of abuse. I didn't even know what was happening to me. I just knew I was depressed and that I wanted more from life, but I felt helpless. Each day spent just managing the abuse. I spent a lot of time trying to protect my son from it, making sure he wasn't exposed to it. As I explained earlier, after the attack, I was diagnosed with PTSD and dealing with ongoing court proceedings and abuse from my ex's friends and family. I declined the offer for refuge and was moved into a house. I still had hardly any money to survive. When we moved to our new home, I had no furniture or household goods. I was using sheets taped around the windows for curtains. And then the debt letters started coming in. A new letter each day from debt companies demanding money from me and threatening court action. I rang the companies and explained that it wasn't my debt, that I had suffered domestic violence, but was told there was nothing they could do and I was liable for the money as it was in my name. I would break down, pleading with them that there must be something they could do. Not only was I trying to recover and deal with ongoing abuse and threats from my ex's friends and family, I now had the threat of bailiffs and court action. So although the police were doing a good job of protecting me, my friends and family were supportive. A charity was helping me heal. A surgeon could try and fix my wounds. Who could help me be free of this debt? For a while, I didn't know what to do or who to turn to. I was again in survival mode, trying to get through each day. One day, someone recommended a debt charity to me called StepChange. I started using the charity to pay the debts off monthly and had done so for 7 years. It was going to take another 16 years of monthly payments before I would be debt-free. This was a daily burden, and although I had resigned myself to the fact that this was my life now, I wanted to make change for others. So I started doing research and came across surviving economic abuse. I contacted them, explained my situation, and said how I wanted to do what I could to fight for change. I was then told that there may be something they could do to help me with my own situation, and was put in contact with someone from a project from Money Advice that was running at the time. They helped me build up my case and wrote to the creditors requesting a write-off. This was successful and the remaining debts were written off. This was absolutely amazing for me, and I felt like a huge weight had been lifted. Although my debts were written off, the effects of the financial abuse are still with me to this day. This is why it is so important for people to understand how damaging financial abuse is. It has taken me years just to get my life to the point where I am able to pay the bills each month and put food on the table. When you do not have financial freedom, even when you flee from the abuse, you are still trapped, meaning many victims are forced to live in refuges or end up homeless. In many cases, a lack of financial freedom means the victim is forced to return to their abuser. To this day, my ex also uses child maintenance as a way of financially abusing me. So although free from the abuse, I still have an invisible chain linking me to my ex. He is still managing to have control over my life due to the financial abuse. A couple of years ago, fed up with struggling financially, I knew I had to do something to create a better life for my son. And I thought to myself, how can I be completely in control of our lives so that no one could ever control us again? And that's when I had the idea that I would start my own business. So one night I started looking online for business courses and I came across the Prince's Trust. I applied online for their enterprise program and completed the course. With the help of the trust, I was able to set up my business, Always Be You, an ethical clothing brand dedicated to raising awareness and educating people about domestic violence. A percentage of my profits are donated to IDAS, a Yorkshire-based charity supporting anyone experiencing or affected by domestic violence and sexual violence. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Every time I hear you speak, you are just so incredibly powerful. I can't thank you enough for really bringing to life why we're here today and what needs to change. And I think you've touched on a lot of those things as you went through your presentation. And in particular, I think reinforcing that need to ensure that we can address economic abuse post-separation. Because I know alongside yourself and other experts by experience and the victims and survivors who are in contact with us, this can go on for decades, which is something that we really want to avoid. And just to say, I'm getting lots of messages here thanking you so much for sharing your story, Rebecca. So, you know, I think it's really being appreciated by those people who are listening today. So thank you again. So I'd now like to move on to the solutions, the responses, what we're doing. So Rebecca spoke very powerfully about how we were able to refer her to the joint project, which we run with Money Advice Plus, and how that debt was written off in her case. And I'd like to introduce you to Jeanette Hope, who has been working on a specific service that integrates money and debt advice with specialist knowledge around domestic abuse for 10 whole years. She's an amazing woman. And Carrie Perrier, who joined the project soon after Jeanette, who is similarly fantastic and committed to this work. Again, I'm really proud to be working with them. They're making real change. We are now part of a double award-winning partnership. I'm delighted that we won Best Partnership with the Institute of Money Advisors, so kind of really recognised in the financial space. And a few weeks ago, we were also recognised in terms of our partnership working by the Third Sector Awards as well. So it's with great delight and, as I said, with great pride that I introduce you now to Jeanette Hope and Carrie Perrier from Money Advice Plus.
So I'm Karen Perrier, Chief Exec for Money Advice Plus. We're working in partnership for surviving economic abuse for about the last 3 years now. Currently, next slide please, Becky. So currently we run the financial support line for domestic and economic abuse survivors. We provide one-off telephone advice to clients who've experienced domestic abuse, including economic abuse. Now, the financial support line really developed in response to COVID-19. It was always the plan to have a financial support line, but it really was moved forward just in response because we were getting a lot of people call that we couldn't help, or because we currently ran a casework service by appointment. And we recognised that that wasn't going to work in the climate that we were in. And the financial support line really gives self-help resources to empower survivors, to help them deal with their debts and to help them move forward with their financial issues. We signpost to other specialist organisations to help with legal issues because it's one of the biggest areas that crops up that we cannot support with. And we also refer into our specialist money advice and national casework service for those that we can do. We only have a small amount of people that we can help at the moment, but we help as many as we can with the casework service with their debts. Next slide, please. Since May, when the financial support line really started, we've supported 197 individuals, including victim survivors and professionals that we support and give them advice. But what we really notice is not the amount of people that we're supporting, it's the amount of issues that are brought to us. And we've dealt with 548 separate issues and provided a casework service to 127 of victim survivors. And of those that have accessed and support through the financial support line, 99% have reported that are more confident to move forward safely with their finances, and 99% of people felt talking to a money advisor have been a positive experience. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd bring to you some of the issues that are raised, and I know Rebecca covered lots of these already, but legal issues is one of the biggest issues that we face, and it's around financial settlements and maybe non-payment of financial settlements. It has a massive impact on someone being able to move forward safely if mortgages aren't paid and rent isn't paid and utility bills aren't met, including child maintenance payments. Another massive issue that's cropping up is housing, and this includes non-payment of mortgages by the perpetrator, who's part of the financial settlement, and also for the victim survivor not being able to remortgage. They may have been paying a mortgage for years, but then when they come to remortgage and come out of a bad mortgage situation into a better one, they can't do that because their financial circumstances don't match their criteria for that new mortgage. Rent arrears are also a massive issue, including getting a new rent deposit so that someone can move forward safely. But equally, someone's often not rehoused because they have rent arrears already. Coerced debt, we need to recognise, is a massive part of this and the help that people need. And I just wanted to summarise what that means as well. And this includes priority debt, rent arrears and council tax, as well as utility debt. Hire purchase agreements are one that comes up a lot of the time, and often commonly hire purchase agreements are taken out for vehicles by the victim survivor, even when they cannot drive or have no ability to access that vehicle. We help with all non-priority consumer debt, and a frequent issue that's coming up recently is the victim survivor being a guarantor for a loan for the perpetrator. Benefit issues are always something that comes up, working out how to claim benefits for someone that's never claimed a benefit before when they've left the perpetrator, but also equally things around the benefit cap and not being able to access enough money, not the local housing allowance not being big enough to pay the rent so someone can move forward safely, and also what comes up all the time is a joint payment for universal credit and people being unsure and being able to access money. Child maintenance, as Rebecca pointed out, is a huge issue, particularly non-payment by the perpetrator and using it as ways to control someone post-separation. Obviously, the DVLA is also another issue that comes up quite a lot, and that's around driving offences and parking fines that have been developed by the perpetrator. But when the car is in someone else's name, it's often them that are responsible for payment of those fines. Next slide, please. I thought I'd just summarise something that we work with through a case study. And Julie, obviously not the person's name, came into us and we spoke to her over the phone, and she recognised that her partner was becoming more abusive and controlling. And this included, but was not limited to, withholding financial information. She really struggled to understand the finances in the household. The perpetrator obviously froze their joint bank account, so she had no access to any money. And the main concern for her at that point was that she wouldn't be able to pay her credit cards. Now, her credit cards were what she used to use to live off. So if she didn't have access to any credit, how would she have any access to any money? And that included paying the joint mortgage from those credit cards as well, so maintaining a house and a home for her. She was really worried about how she would keep up the repayments, but also wanted to know how this would affect her credit rating if she couldn't make those minimum payments, and then what would she do if she couldn't access any credit in the future? We discussed all the issues that are raised around economic abuse and what would happen if she didn't make payments, and what the consequences of that would be for her moving forward. We signposted her onto other help as well, recognising that she needed more support than what we could give. And I guess the purpose that what we tried to do was to arm her with the knowledge that she needed to move forward safely. And this included how she could draw up her own budget and work on what her own income was and what she had available to her and how she could move forward. I'm now going to introduce you to Jeanette Hope.
Thank you, Karen. Hello there, everybody. My name is Jeanette Hope, and I have been a qualified money advisor for 13 years, and I've been working with victims and survivors of domestic abuse on a specialist project for 10 years now. We provide a national casework service, and this covers the whole of England and Wales. We provide training to frontline organisations to increase their knowledge and understanding of economic abuse, such as housing associations, money advice services, and domestic abuse services as well. The project is drawn on previous work of Money Advice Plus, and it brings together specialist knowledge of money advice with domestic abuse, including economic abuse. And the National Casework is the first service of its kind which brings together the money advice and economic abuse. It recognises the needs of victims and survivors, and it's tailored to their specific needs. Next slide, please, Becky. So the aims of the work that we do is to support people affected by domestic abuse who are also struggling with their money problems, which may or may not be directly linked to the abuse. Generally, it's directly coercive control, but sometimes they might have had money problems before the abuse or after the abuse is finished. We also aim to directly improve the financial circumstances of people affected by domestic abuse, and to provide the victim and survivors of abuse with the knowledge and confidence to deal with their finances in the future. And some clients may never have been allowed to take control of their own finances, and this might be the first time that they're in control of their own money. We aim to provide an understanding of economic abuse and how it's affected them, and the correlation between the economic abuse, which they might not have picked up on before and just maybe thought it was just their psychological abuse. And we integrate safety into the process of our money advice. We look at all aspects of the safety. Is it safe to freeze a joint bank account if they're still living with the perpetrator, for example, because this may put them at greater risk if he goes mad, if she does that. So we only advise them to do things which will keep them safe at that moment in time. And we aim to create an understanding that economic safety and the physical safety are directly linked. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the casework service can work with women as long as needed, and this can be up to 3 years in some cases, especially if the victim survivors are moving around a lot into refuge and then being rehoused. They can dip in and out of the service as is needed. We use a lot of write-off requests in the casework that we do, and we've developed a template write-off request letter which we send out to creditors, which is tailor-made on behalf of clients, and that's quite a big part of the work that we do when supporting survivors with debts that have been coerced. We draw up sustainable budget plans, look at benefit entitlements, trust funds and benevolent funds, and we advise on all options available to them to help manage and clear their debts while focusing on the abuse and how it's affected them. So we'll look at debt relief orders, bankruptcy, debt management plans, IVAs, token offers, and again, especially write-off requests. Next slide, please. So via the partnership with Surviving Economic Abuse, for the first time, we've routinely screened for economic abuse using a screening tool which has 20 questions in it. The tool can help victims and survivors make connections between the abuser's actions and their own financial situations. It can uncover things they didn't realise were part of the abuse as well. And it can identify possible repercussions going forward, and it gives us an idea of their long-term and medium support that they're going to need with our service. So just an example of some of the 20 questions are, did he stop you from accessing any money to pay for bills? Demand that you give receipts to them, hide money so you couldn't find it, keep you from having a job or going to work, make you take out a loan or buy something on credit when you didn't want to, make you use your money to buy them things and pay their bills when you didn't want to, steal property, put bills into their name so that they're liable, force or pressure to hand over savings and other assets as well, and destroying property. So these are just some of the questions that we integrate into our appointments at the beginning. Next slide, please. So the issues faced by our casework service, these include problems obtaining debt information if they've fled from their home and they're living in a refuge, for example. Difficulties closing, severing joint bank accounts without the agreements of the perpetrators. Needing to open a safe bank account if they're living in a refuge. Accessing legal aid since the government cuts, it's very difficult, especially if they don't have any evidence of physical abuse and the domestic abuse. Difficulties getting clients' names removed from bills when they've left and there's a debt in their name. And the time it takes to get benefits in place as well when they've been left with no money. And also the impact of immigration status on entitlements to benefits and if they've got no recourse to public funds. Next slide, please. Also being left to pay unaffordable mortgages and not being able to remortgage is a big one. Problems enforcing court orders in regards to financial settlements. Perpetrators will often do anything to sabotage survivors by withholding money and not paying them or dragging out the financial settlement. There's a lack of consistent responses by creditors in regards to debts and the result of economic abuse. And this can include asking us and them for large amounts of paperwork, police reports, medical letters, supporting letters, and also asking victims to go through old bank statements to identify what transactions were theirs and which ones weren't. And this can bring up a lot of traumatic memories for survivors, having to go through all of this again and keep repeating their story. And even when they want us to send every bit of evidence, often creditors might say it's not enough and we won't write it off. Next slide, please. So the National Casework Service it supported 233 people over the last 18 months. Only 25% of those were working. 51% were identified as having at least one health need and 22% reported having mental ill health. The average number of debts was 5 per person that was supported, but the highest number of debts was 27 debts in total of coerced debt. And 44% had priority debts that they needed help with. We found that there was a significant increase in both confidence and money knowledge after our casework with these clients, and they felt better to move forward. Thank you. I'll now pass back to Karen Perrier.
And really, I'm going to speak about what we're going to do next, really, and drawing on the work of both Surviving Economic Abuse and Money Advice Plus. And I'm really going to go back to one of the issues that Jeanette raised, which was a lack of consistent response by creditors and asking for lots of documentation, including highlighting sort of through bank statements over many, many years, transactions of economic abuse. And I really think this shows that there's a lack of understanding of what economic abuse is. And also this has an impact for obviously the victim survivor of reliving that abuse, but also it has an impact for the person that's sort of dealing with that documentation that has no understanding or has no understanding and is not ready to deal with that sort of information being sent through to them on the other end. So what we've done, next slide please, was develop the economic abuse evidence form. And this was really developed in order to improve responses by creditors and also to improve the response of money and debt advice sector. So they obviously look at economic abuse when dealing with people that are come to them for help with their debts. And what we have found that creditors do not understand the experience of coercive control and economic abuse. And in the money advice sector, from the training that we've delivered, 83% of debt advisors have never had training on economic abuse. And the economic abuse evidence form really recognises that individuals have been coerced into debt by an intimate partner or family member. And it sets out the context of the form, and it looks at the coercive and controlling behaviour introduced under the Serious Crime Act, including physical, sexual and emotional abuse. It uses part of the economic screening tool to place the abuse in context, and it takes into account safety issues. So it allows the creditor to look at safety issues when contacting the victim and survivor, and anything else they might need in how to respond to that debt that we're raising with the individual. I'm now going to hand you back to Nicola.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Karen. And thank you, Jeanette, for giving us an overview of the work that we're doing on the National Financial Support Line and the National Casework system as well. It goes to show really how much you can achieve in 3 years, because I remember having a conversation with Jeanette on the tube. We just delivered some joint training. And she said, wow, wouldn't it be amazing if we could create something like the mental health evidence form, which is something that's already being used in the money and debt advice space with creditors, and create something similar around economic abuse. And it's really exciting to have worked with Money Advice Plus to develop that form. We have consulted on it widely across the domestic abuse and money and debt advice sector. And I'm excited to say that we're going to be launching a pilot of that next year. And we hope to roll that out nationally by the end of the year. But certainly really reassuringly is that as part of the UK financial wellbeing strategy, there are a number of challenge groups which are working to advise the Money and Pension Service on how they implement that strategy. And a couple of weeks ago, they made some urgent recommendations to the Money and Pension Service around what needs to happen in light of COVID. And they specifically picked up on the need to address economic abuse and the debts that have been created as a consequence of that. So our understanding is that the Money and Pension Service will soon be responding to that report by the challenge chairs and this recommendation specifically. So we're hopeful that there will be a national support around that national pilot, which, as I said, will be kicking off in 2021. I also just want to flag, many of you might have questions around this, that obviously credit ratings are very badly impacted by coerced debt. And as Rebecca has explained, it's very difficult to access credit going forward. So we also plan to use the economic abuse evidence form as something that we can also share with the experience of this world, so that they can make a note on credit reports that that debt was coerced. And hopefully that will be a mechanism by which we can seek to start to repair some of those damaged credit ratings as well. So we're really excited about that piece of work and looking forward to progressing it. So now I'd like to introduce you to Helen Hansel, who is the Relationship Manager at StepChange. In the past year, we've been working more and more closely with StepChange. She works alongside Paula and Tom, also at StepChange, as part of the working group, which is overseeing this joint work. And we're really excited to welcome her here today and to hear more about that work. So thank you, Helen, and welcome.
Thank you, Nicola, and good morning to everyone. Next slide, please, Becky. So I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes just introducing the charity that I work for. I know that some of you will be familiar with us, but perhaps not everybody. So we are a UK-wide debt advice charity. We've been around for 25 years, and we provide free, very importantly, independent, impartial and confidential advice through the two mediums of online and telephone. We help people to deal with all sorts of different debt problems. Some people will present with very small debts, others will present with incredibly large debts of £1 million plus. We are there to help everybody, regardless of their size of debt, types of debt. And unfortunately, it is a very, very big issue in this country, and one person every 48 seconds will contact us for help. We have access to the full range of debt solutions. The type of debt solutions available to you will be dependent on which part of the UK you live in, but we are able to advise on all of them, and we can offer tailored end-to-end advice, whichever method of communication you use, be that online or by speaking to a telephone advisor. We also offer additional support to our most vulnerable clients through our dedicated advocacy team. Around 40 to 45% of our clients will present with an additional vulnerability on top of their financial vulnerability. One of the most common additional vulnerabilities is mental health, but we are seeing a number of clients coming through to us presenting with issues arising from domestic abuse. Interestingly, we are finding that more people are disclosing domestic abuse via our online channels than through our telephone channels. Partnerships are incredibly important to us at StepChange, and we partner with specialist organisations who can offer their expertise to our clients. And one of our most recent partnerships has been with Surviving Economic Abuse and Nick and her team. Next slide, please. So we accept and we understand that we can't be the expert in everything. And back in early 2019, we completed a very comprehensive review of our vulnerability strategy. And one of the big outcomes of that was that we felt it would hugely benefit clients by us partnering with various specialist organisations who could offer clients more support in areas that we didn't have the expertise in. We are the experts and we have the expertise in debt advice and understanding all the nuances of that, but very rarely will our clients present just with a financial difficulty. There's often a lot of other issues that surround that vulnerability around finances, whether it's issues around health, whether it's issues around relationships, education, all sorts of different reasons. And so what we felt it was important to do was to reach out to other organisations that have that expertise and form those partnerships. We also appointed our very first vulnerability product manager, and that's my colleague Paula Sell. And Paula Sell's sole focus is looking at the vulnerability offering and support that we can provide to our clients through the entire journey from start to finish, whether that be online or over the phone or a mixture of the two. So we began our partnership with Surviving Economic Abuse and Money Advice Plus about 2 years ago. And it's not just been a simple referral partnership, it's so much more than this. It spans our policy, the way that we make decisions, it spans the process, so how we can better deal with clients who present with issues that our partner can help with, and also training for all our advisors. We're a fairly large organisation, we have upwards of 1,500 colleagues, so the training has been a huge benefit to our advisors and given them that confidence to deal with clients. Next slide, please. So as I've just mentioned, the partnership that we have with Surviving Economic Abuse and Money Advice Plus is not just around training, it is so much more than that. So in the very early days, we had support by just simply call listening. So inviting the partnership to come in and listen to some of our calls and to get some honest feedback on where they thought we were doing a good job and where we could perhaps make some improvements to our service. Off the back of that, we then worked with Surviving Economic Abuse and Money Advice Plus to develop a range of training for our colleagues. So charity-wide, we were extremely pleased to be able to work with them to develop an e-learning module, which has gone out to all client-facing colleagues. This forms part of our wider vulnerability training programme and has also involved us working with a host of other partners who have expertise in areas that we don't. Next slide, please. And of course, one of the big benefits of the partnership that we have is the ability for some of our colleagues to be able to refer clients who need additional support. So we're now at a point where all our advisors have been upskilled and have additional skills and knowledge and expertise to support and better advise clients who are dealing with economic abuse within a domestic violence setting. But we also have this referral partnership where when we feel it's appropriate and when we feel it's above and beyond what we're comfortable dealing with, we can refer clients for further advice. So the way it currently works, if a client discloses domestic abuse, then be that over the telephone or through our online channels, we will, if we feel it's appropriate, we will refer them to our vulnerable client team, which is a group of colleagues who are based in our Cardiff office. And then they will look to work more closely with the client. And if it's then evident that a client needs additional support on top of what they can offer, then that's when they will make a referral. And generally, the kind of situations when that would arise would be if the client is still living with the perpetrator, if it is a coerced debt, or also if it is a joint debt. And I just wanted to finish by showing an example of how the partnership has enabled a client that we were working with to have the best possible outcome. So here's just a little bit of information about Anna's story. So Anna had been dealing with domestic violence for a number of years. She had suffered physical, psychological, emotional and economic abuse. Although she's no longer with the perpetrator, the health issues that she sustained as the result of physical abuse continue to remain with her. She was coerced into taking out debts to fund her ex-partner's lifestyle. He used that money to fund lavish travel, to also purchase expensive gifts for family and friends. Eventually, Anna left the abusive relationship, and as a result of that had to relocate. Also because of the previous years and the time with her ex-partner, she had a lack of savings. And then also factoring in what we've experienced this year with the pandemic and furlough, Anna was really struggling financially. And all those factors compounded together, and it had left her with debt of around £20,000. By working with an advocate that we referred Anna to, the advocate has worked with Anna in the 3 debts that she has. And I'm pleased to report that already one creditor has agreed to write off the debt. However, it does also show the inconsistencies within the creditor world, as Jeanette and Karen talked about earlier. So Anna had the 3 debts. One creditor, thankfully, has agreed to write off the debt with no further action, and the account has been updated. Another creditor has so far refused to write off the debt, citing lack of evidence. And this is a really big problem because there is no real evidence that the advocate can provide. The debt stems from some time ago. Anna isn't able to provide any tangible evidence aside from her story. So thankfully the advocate is going to pursue this and appeal that decision. And then the final creditor has intimated that they will possibly be able to write it off, and we're just waiting. But I hope that case study just highlights the importance of this partnership. And whilst we were able to offer Anna some interim advice and provide some respite for the time being by looking at token payments, by having this partnership in place, it's enabled us to refer Anna to the experts who have this expertise in dealing with coerced debt. And we are certainly looking at a much more positive outcome than we were a few months ago. Thank you very much. I'll pass you back to Nick.
Thanks so much, Helen. I think this is really timely, our partnership, just thinking about COVID. Certainly we know, because a lot of victims and survivors are with perpetrators at the moment and can't reach out safely through the traditional channels, for example, to some domestic abuse charities, that we are seeing a lot more disclosure in kind of more generic spaces, whether that be within a customer vulnerability team at a bank, for example, or organisations such as StepChange, where there is a financial link, but certainly being in contact with them does not necessarily arouse the suspicions of a perpetrator. So as I said at the beginning, we're hugely delighted to be working with you. As I said, it feels very, very timely, and together I'm hoping that we can challenge some of these issues around lack of evidence. I know that's something that's coming up in the Q&A box that I'm keeping an eye on, and so certainly going forward with the economic abuse evidence form and all working together, we can start to really move this forward so that victims and survivors do get the response that they need consistently across all creditors. So thanks again so much, Helen. Really, really appreciate your time today. So I'd like to pass on now to our next speaker, who is Judy Barber. Those of you on Twitter might have seen her talking head already this morning, talking about the work that we do here at Surviving Economic Abuse. Because debt is a regulated area of activity, we jointly employ Judy with Money Advice Plus. And I suppose that's something really important to flag to people. Certainly in the scoping study for the Economic Justice Project, we found that sometimes through the best of intentions, some domestic abuse or other caseworkers were kind of straying into the debt advice space. And it's really important that this information is given by people who are qualified to do it in the best manner possible. So Judy joined us back in early 2019. She was the fourth member of the Surviving Economic Abuse team, and she is such a wonderful woman to work alongside. She has really skilled up in the debt space and really brought her vast domestic abuse knowledge to that. And certainly within the Economic Justice Project evaluation, there is glowing praise from Solace Women's Aid, who Judy will talk about, where she was based as part of the pilot, where a lot of women talked about how she has provided the best advocacy for them that they have ever received. So I don't think there's any higher recommendation for that. So I'd just like to pass on to the amazing Judy, please.
Thank you, Nick. Can I move to the next slide, please, Becky? Thank you. So my role is part of the Economic Justice Project, which is Surviving Economic Abuse's founding project, actually. And as Nicola mentioned at the beginning, the evaluation report is launched this week. So I think it would be very interesting for a lot of people to read in depth about what we've achieved. But just briefly, the Economic Justice Project seek to look for innovative ways to challenge coerced debt and to financially, economically empower women who have been subjected to this. And my part of this project is at the end of the list here, the domestic violence debt advocate role. We've since changed the job title, I'll just clarify now to avoid confusion, to debt and benefit specialist, because although obviously we were focused on debt and on coerced debt, issues with access to benefits, income maximization, economic well-being in general, obviously mean that debt and benefit issues are very much linked. And I know when I was sitting within Solace and also in contact with other economic, domestic abuse organisations, issues with benefits came up often in inquiries from professionals and from the women themselves. So just a heads up, there might be two job titles floating around, but they both refer to the same role. Next slide, please, Becky. So this is me. We had a cartoonist visit us at work, and he did sort of miniature portraits of us all, sort of capturing the work we do. And I couldn't have expressed it in any better way, really. Sometimes the perpetrator has gone physically, and women describe how they've taken measures, they've gotten support to be physically safe. They're themselves and their children, they're perhaps addressing the effects of psychological abuse, of sexual assaults, but economic abuse, and in particularly the debt, leaves that shadow, and that's something that can remain with them for months or so potentially years. It's this type of abuse doesn't need physical proximity of the perpetrator to be carried on, and it's something that remains after the relationship is ended. Next slide, please. So just a bit more about my role. So the idea was to bring the two sectors really of domestic abuse support and financial money and debt advice together. So the role is for someone with an advanced understanding of both of these sectors. And at the beginning of my employment with C and Money Advice Plus, who I'm jointly employed by, I was co-located within a specialist domestic abuse service to support the overall capacity of the service in responding to economic abuse and providing more wider and more intense advocacy for women. And in practice, this meant that I was physically located within Solace Women's Aid, who we mentioned quite a lot, domestic abuse service in Islington in North London, and that was 1 day a week to provide debt and benefit advice to women who were already using the services there. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, the point of the role is a link between these two different sectors. As often we found that women might be getting support around their safety, housing, the legal position when it comes to sort of getting injunctions or divorce, or getting advice on family law, emotional well-being from a domestic abuse service and their partners. Then they might be seeing a debt or money advisor separately to address the effects of the economic abuse of the coerced debt. And these two sectors would both be doing excellent work, but separately and not necessarily in communication with each other. And we know in general, joint partnership means joint working means greater safety for women and more effective outcomes. So that is really what the Economic Justice Project was about, my role was about. And often that is offering training to debt advisors and money advisors in general, to enable them to integrate awareness of domestic abuse and the risk issues there into their everyday work and practice as money workers, and applying what we call a safety lens to their work. So looking at their work with an awareness of domestic abuse, and I will give some examples of that in the coming slides. And on the other side of it as well, it's offering training and specialist advice to domestic abuse workers. Now, being based within Solace Women's Aid meant working, when we could do such a thing before COVID, like working in the office there meant that I was on hand to answer any questions that the IDVAs or the support workers had there in terms of debt, what could be done, in terms of financial documents that might be needed, in terms of benefit. And I could also use their considerable knowledge and resources when it came to the services that women required when it comes to maintaining their physical safety. And that brings us to one of the main points of my role, which is integrating women's physical and economic safety. We've often found, and I was a domestic violence worker for many years before coming to surviving economic abuse, so I was guilty of this too, that the idea of economic safety is not a priority, really. When working with women, we'll obviously think about their physical safety, their housing, the immediate risk, but often, asking questions such as, do you have access to money? Do you have access to your bank account? That came at the end. But what we know is that it's not possible to be safe physically if you don't have that degree of economic safety there and access to resources. Okay, next slide, please, Becky. So these are some examples of work that we can do together. So work that I did when based within Solace. So I would advise the women that we use in the services and the professionals working with them on how to integrate their economic and physical safety. And women who sought help might be in different stages of their lives, or of the situation with the abuser. It could be that they were still living with the abuser, or that he was still in their lives, but they were planning to leave or to have him removed, or they could be in the process of doing that, or often it was afterwards where they had left. They might be in refuge, for example, and they were rebuilding their lives, after having left. So obviously the approach needed in these different stages is different depending on the woman's need. So what I could advise on is gathering financial information. So I know when a woman is rebuilding her life after having fled, it's sometimes she needs to open a new bank account. For example, she needs to qualify for legal aid, but potentially may need to get legal advice on a number of things. And often she's asked to produce documents such as bank statements, deeds of the property, if there's a mortgage, for example, a tenancy agreement, proof of being in receipt of benefit. And these are things that we could advise. And in our resources, which I'll be talking about later on our website, that there's information about documents that can be useful. So another thing that we would do with women is clarifying the status of assets and liabilities. So we would ask if a woman had just left, for example, were the bills that in the property you left, were they in your name or the perpetrator's name, and helping her, take her name off bills that she might still be liable for. Do you have a bank account? If so, is it joint or in your sole name? Using bank services safely. We have a webinar on banking coming up in the next few weeks, which hopefully some of you will be able to attend, where we can talk about this in more detail. But we would advise women on approaching the bank to ask for joint banks to be closed, for example, for new bank accounts to be set up safely that the perpetrator doesn't have access to. Banks can also provide non-geographical sort codes. So if the perpetrator needed to, if the woman needed to be in touch with the perpetrator, for example, for him to pay child maintenance into her account, she could use a bank account which didn't have a sort code, which could identify her address. The use of credit reference, using credit reference agencies safely, and safely delinking from the perpetrator in terms of joint bank account and joint credit and credit files. And as Jeanette referred to earlier, often this is something that we would have to speak to the woman about, to say, is it safe for you to close a joint bank account now, or is it something that needs to be done later on, perhaps when you're in a place of safety? How will the perpetrator react to that? With credit files, for example, a lot of women and professionals as well weren't aware that if she requested an up-to-date credit report, for example, and put in her new address, and she still has joint credit with the perpetrator, he may be able to see the new information that she's put in there. So that's something that we needed to flag up with professionals who were advising this course of action. And another area that we offer advice on is maximization of income. And a very rewarding part of the job sometimes was helping women get their own income, sometimes for the first time in years, or the first time in their lives, is in a case study which I'll speak about in a minute. But this was something that had to be done again with the safety lens, very carefully. So applying for child maintenance, for example, we would do this in the context of a safety plan with the women. Is now a safe time to make that application? How will the perpetrator react? We would often support her to call the child maintenance options and explain the situation, explain that it's not safe for her to be contacting the perpetrator for him to pay her directly, that she needs a bank account with a non-geographical sort code that he can pay into, and that it's something that they need to do on her behalf. Making benefit claims, and this is part of the training that I did with money advice workers, was highlighting the fact that although income maximization is obviously a very powerful and useful tool, if a woman makes a benefit claim and she's been living with the perpetrator and perhaps they have a joint claim already, he's going to be aware of this. For example, his benefits may be reduced or stopped if she makes a new claim in her own right. So this is something that has to be approached carefully. It has to be done perhaps when she's in a safe place away from the perpetrator, and his reaction around that needs to be managed. Next slide, please, Becky. And these are some examples of work that can be done by the domestic abuse sector to support the work of debt advice, because, as I mentioned, these two sectors have worked separately. Traditionally, women and vulnerable people in general would will be getting support from both, but the workers aren't necessarily communicating with each other. And as Nicola mentioned earlier, debt advice is regulated, so only qualified debt advisors can give debt advice, but there are many things that other support workers can do to support this work. And as part of my role, often part of the work we do in general, is requesting write-offs of coerced debt. And one of the most effective tools we have in sort of pushing creditors to agree to this is supporting letters. And often, by its nature, by the nature of economic abuse, we don't necessarily have evidence to offer. Perpetrators don't conveniently provide evidence for us to show creditors. But one thing which is very powerful is a supporting letter from other agencies that are working, also working with the women we are supporting. And in the case study that I'll speak of in a minute, I'll show how that can be, how that can be very effective. And another thing that support workers can do to help the work of debt advisors is completing sort of the household budgets with clients and supporting them to gather relevant documents. So if, for example, what I would advise the caseworkers and the advisors at Solace to do if they were referring a woman for debt advice is to speak to her beforehand to help prepare her for the appointment. Because, as it says in the next point, it's emotional support is needed. There is a lot of shame around being the victim of domestic abuse, and there's a lot of shame around having debt. So dealing with these two things together can really pose a formidable barrier to seeking help. And it's not an easy thing to speak to a complete stranger over the phone and talk about how much you spend, how much you spend on toiletries, on pocket money for your children, on leisure. It's the question can feel quite intrusive, especially for women who have already been perhaps told by perpetrators that they're useless with money, that it's their fault that they're in debt, that they're unable to support themselves. So there is a potential that speaking to a debt advisor can bring up can trigger these memories. So what I often advise is that the caseworkers who already have an established relationship with the women, help them complete the household budget so they're ready with the information before the debt advisor takes it over the phone, and helps them gather the relevant documents such as the letters from creditors, the bank statements that we require, and the reference numbers for the various debts, and to provide emotional support throughout that process, because it's not easy. Debt is emotive, and money in general is an emotive subject. And often we're dealing with women whose spending has been policed by the perpetrator for years, and they've been deprived of knowledge of their own finances, and at times they've had to account for every penny that they've spent. What I also advise is that when referring to a debt advice charity or to a money service or to a money advice service, is that we ensure that the risk issues such as economic abuse are highlighted. So the person taking on that referral understands that there is a perpetrator in the picture, and that perhaps advising on some of the things I mentioned before, such as applying for benefits or checking credit files, it could potentially put her at risk if there's still those links with the perpetrators. So the workers on the other side there are aware of that. And also the awareness on economic abuse isn't necessarily what it should be throughout in the services throughout the country. So as well, we recommend, if you're coming up against professionals who don't understand what economic abuse is, what coerced debt is, we do have resources on the C website, which I'll speak about at the end, which explain in clear and in clear language, what this type of abuse is, so that other professionals can become aware of this. Next slide, please, Becky. Okay, so the example I'm going to read through is of a woman who was referred to Solace Women's Aid, who I worked with for just over a year, I think, and say it was an example of joint working between Money Advice Plus, which is a debt advice charity, and Solace Women's Aid. But when writing the case study, I realised there were actually 9 different organisations, different agencies involved in supporting this woman. So it was really multi-agency work, and I'm happy to say that we did get an excellent outcome in this case, but it was a long process, and I think this case study in particular shows how complex it can be and the inconsistency of responses from creditors, as I think Helen has already alluded to. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Okay, so this is Vera. Obviously the names have been changed. So she's a woman in her 60s who has been married to the abuser for over 30 years. And during this time, she was working for some of that time as a carer, but they had a joint bank account which he controlled, and he was also appointed himself responsible for the household finances. She was given pocket money, to use his description, and was asked to account for every purchase that she made when she went out. So if she, for example, if she bought sanitary towels, she would have to explain. She would have to show him the receipt and explain that, and he would count the change to make sure there were no pennies missing. Eventually, she stopped work due to stress, and he wouldn't allow her to claim benefits because he said we're not the type of people who depend on the state. So thus restricting her from from benefit from economic resources that could have helped her. He coerced her into taking out a bank loan, which he spent. It was to fund his lifestyle, and she did not benefit from. And in addition to this, she relied on catalogues to buy basic necessities such as clothes, household items, basic things that she needed to have a very basic quality of life. And just over a year ago now, she made the very brave decision to leave. She went to stay with a family member and self-referred to Age UK in that area, who then referred her to Solace Women's Aid. And she began working with an IDFA at Solace Women's Aid, who then referred her to myself for the debt and benefit advice. So the debt and benefit specialist, which is myself, and the IDFA, we worked together to support her to claim benefits. And this was the first time she'd claimed benefits in her life, age 60, to secure a bank account, because the perpetrator had access to it beforehand. We spoke to the bank, referred her to the specialist team, and they changed her passwords. They got her a new card, so her account was secure and her ex-husband couldn't interfere with that. Seek legal advice on an injunction because he continued to harass her, and the divorce and financial settlement. The work with the solicitor is still ongoing, but she hopes to be divorced, hopefully within the next year, and to access counselling and find safe accommodation. So, and in addition to that, we wrote letters to each of the creditors to request that they write the debts off. And she is now debt-free, but the response from the creditors was not consistent, as is the case as we've been hearing. One creditor agreed to write the debt off straight away. Another agreed about 2 months ago, and required several prompts really to get to that stage. But she is now debt-free, in safe accommodation, and she has a reliable income from Universal Credit and PIP. And as I said, there were 9 different organisations involved there. There was Solace Women's Aid, myself, Age UK, the local job centre, who were very helpful, the legal aid solicitors, and a specialist housing service who offered her the accommodation. And part of the success in getting the write-off was being able to gather evidence from the adfer at Solace, from her GP, from a counsellor she was referred to at Mind, and present these to the creditors in order to show that although we don't have physical evidence that she was forced to take out this loan, that it was her husband who benefited from it, they were able to show her story and the effect that the economic abuse had had on her, and they agreed when faced with this type of evidence to write the debt off. Okay, next slide, please, Becky. And as Nicola mentioned at the beginning, the Economic Justice Report has been launched this week, and one of the main findings there is that economic abuse should be recognised as a vital part of safety planning to reduce immediate risk and meet longer term need. So again, in the past, money and access to money hasn't been seen as particularly important. I remember when I worked in just the domestic abuse sector, we would often hear phrases such as, money isn't important, possessions are just things. But if you think, how does somebody get to a place of safety in the first place if they have no access to their bank card, if they have no access to cash? How do they claim benefits if they can't access documents proving who they are? These are things that need to be taken into account when we're safety planning. And as well, the debt and benefits specialist role should be a nationally recognised role as well. It should be a role which is found in services throughout the country, and local policymakers and commissioners should ensure that the violence against women and girls and domestic abuse strategies address economic safety, undertake needs assessments, and ensure services are trained on economic abuse and include specialist money and debt advice. And the feedback we've had from the trainees has been very, very positive. And often, along with domestic abuse services in particular, they were aware of economic abuse. They weren't aware of potentially of the extent of it and the strategies perpetrators use and the tools that are available to help support women who've experienced it. And as well, and final recommendation is private institutions, for example, financial institutions, should be part of the coordinated community response to domestic abuse. As often women will face barriers when trying to get their banks, for example, to cooperate, or as we've seen, creditors where they owe money to that they've been coerced into borrowing. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. So as part of the Economic Justice Project, we've taken what we've learned in sort of the frontline work within Solace Women's Aid and from the questions that we get from professionals who contact us, and from women as well who've survived economic abuse, and produced a series of resources on our website. Sometimes if women aren't able to contact our financial support line or to seek help directly, sometimes reading the resources on the website can be the way that they get the information that they need. And there are several there. These are just examples, and they're divided into two categories really: resources for victim survivors and resources for professionals. So looking at the resources for victim survivors first, we start from the beginning. What is economic abuse? That's how to recognise it. Because I think, and I've seen a couple of comments in the chat that economic abuse can be very subtle, at least at the beginning, and it's not easy to recognise straight away. We use the term in plain sight as well, because it's a type of abuse that is so ingrained in the way that we live as a society. Still, men are seen as the breadwinner often, and women as the homemaker or whatever. Sometimes economic abuse can hide behind these these constructs. So we really start from the beginning in identifying perpetrator tactics, and also grants and financial help that are available to women, and the information on the economic abuse and the domestic abuse bill. Also, there's coerced debt, how to challenge coerced debt, insolvency options, dealing with, we've recently produced resources on dealing with bailiffs as well, which is a cause of a lot of distress for many of the women who contact us. So I definitely recommend having a look at those and signposting the women you work with towards them. So on the next slide, we'll see some of the resources for frontline providers. So screening for economic abuse. This refers to the screening tool that Jeanette spoke about at the in her section of the presentation, where we have the 20 questions, and we also have a conversation kit which professionals can use to begin a dialogue with clients about what economic abuse is, and also conversation kits for banks and for the financial institutions, and how to recognise economic abuse and how to support customers who are facing this, and examples of best practice there. So there's more information on how to access these on our website, but please do have a look, because there's really a wealth of information and resources there. Okay, so that brings me to the end, and I think I'll hand back to Nicola.
Fantastic, Judy. Thank you so much. And as Judy said, all the resources are available on our website, and those for professionals, we do just ask that you email us, and we can send those directly to you. Some great comments in the chat, Judy, talking about how this was a brilliant presentation, a lot of important learning, lots to take away. So I think you have really inspired people about the work that you're doing, which is fantastic. And someone's just talked about the great insight that you've shown into this issue as well. So thanks so much. So now I'd like to move us along. We are entering into the question and answer session, but before we do so, I am delighted to welcome Nicole Jacobs, who is the Domestic Abuse Commissioner. There she is, she's just popped up as if by magic. Nicole has been a huge supporter of this project from the very beginning. So back in March 2017, when I just had the idea of the charity, or at least started to set it up back in January, we did apply to the tampon tax via the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport for some money. And obviously, as a charity with no track record, still in the throes of registering with the Charity Commission, it was some tall order to kind of get through that process. But the department showed huge confidence in the idea of what we wanted to do and really wanted to make that happen. And it was people like Nicole and others who wrote letters in support of what we were trying to do, which meant we were able to get over that hurdle. So that we can be here 3 years later to really hear about the amazing difference that this project has made. So I am more than delighted to welcome Nicole Jacobs, as I said, the Designated Domestic Abuse Commissioner, but we know her from her days of CEO at Standing Together. And I imagine a bit of a prompt, but I don't think I need to give you this at all, Nicole, that she'll also make reference to the importance of this work within the coordinated community response. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nicole before the Q&A session. Thanks, Nicole.
Oh, thank you. That's such a lovely introduction. And I remember those days very well. And I was just listening to Rebecca, Karen, Jeanette, Helen, Judy, and just thinking, Nicola, about you and your team and all of the things that you all collectively have achieved in the last few years. And it's pretty phenomenal. And I think about my own days as a frontline worker, probably more years ago than I'd like to admit, but how I would have often felt just so frustrated and, not able to address this range of issues, and not even really able to ask very much about it, knowing that these partnerships didn't exist. There was so few options. It was not an area of work that was carved out as such. And I feel like that's very much what you've done, and so many of the speakers today have been doing, and we just owe them a huge debt of gratitude for leading the way and being you know, real trailblazers, front runners, all of those things. And it really impacts people's lives, as we've heard. And so I just want to acknowledge all of your work and all of the presenters today, and your team, Nicola, at Surviving Economic Abuse. I'm so excited to hear about these, you know, the kind of evidence forms, the partnerships. So often we need a thread of work running through all of our services in relation to domestic abuse, because it's not the kind of issue that you can kind of silo off. So, you know, this idea of partnership with debt advice services, real integration, meaningful partnerships that really help unpick exactly what I was listening to, that I was so interested to hear is, you know, at what point do you decide it really is important to get another partner involved? You know, when someone's still living with the perpetrator, for example, things like that, just having those agreements and understanding and work practices. And I'm sure you all feel there's so much more to do. So as the designate domestic abuse commissioner, for those of you who haven't met me or heard about my office before, I was appointed by government about a year ago. I'm not party political, independent of government, very much there to advise, but also hold government to account. And in doing that, in developing my team over the last year, we're very focused on policy work, but also mapping of services, really being much more precise about what services are commissioned, how sustainably funded are they, and for the whole family. I saw in the chat people asking questions about male victims. I think of my remit as extending obviously to male or female victims, but also children, perpetrators who want to change. We really need to widen and really increase our ambition for what good looks like in this area. And I often try to remember, you know, my own 20-some years of work in this area, and the fact that, you know, our refuges are nearing about 50 years old. You know, the interventions over time and our coordinated community response is truly changing month to month, you know, year to year, and we're getting better and better at this. And I think we have to acknowledge where we are, and the work that you're doing and the interests you have, if you've logged into this this webinar, is truly kind of the next really significant step forward. So we see that in the bill. I totally agree with Nicola's comments at the very start about the need for the change, the amendment that would require the change for the coercion and control legislation, so that it would be applicable post-separation. We all must put on our to-do list now, reaching out to MPs, if you know anyone in the House of Lords, really highlighting that amendment, because the bill is, we're waiting for a date for the House of Lords, kind of a stage of the bill to start. And we're thinking that will be hopefully between now and the new year. And so it's a perfect time. In fact, it's the ideal time to be talking again about this. And there's several amendments and kind of debates about the bill. And the reality is sometimes this amendment gets a bit lost in the shuffle. So it's really, really important that we communicate about the importance of this change, so that we could have that coercion and control legislation applicable to post-separation abuse. Because of course, as you've heard today, this is where we see the most of our financial economic abuse happening. And so we've really got to make sure that government and realize that this is an important change they need to go ahead and make now, not delay it for another opportunity, another bill down the line. So that's a really one thing I'd really love to get across today, that it's a vital opportunity. I think there's some more changes to the bill that are needed. You know, migrant women, people who have limited recourse to public funds, really need to be included in the bill. That impacts some of the conversations and what we're talking about today. And also just having a wider breadth of a statutory duty for domestic abuse services in general. So right now the bill covers refuge or accommodation-based services, and I think the government should take the opportunity now to extend that to a wider breadth of services. You've heard today, and we haven't gotten into the detail, but a lot of these partnerships and a lot of the places where people will go for support and advice in domestic abuse, those are the very charities that literally struggle year to year to make ends meet. And so Judy, who co-locates or works with Solace Women's Aid, you know, that's the kind of charity. It's a really well-established charity doing great, but they will be cobbling together you know, so many different sources of funding, and we could change that in the bill. And I just wanted to highlight again, you know, opportunities right in front of us. So if you were having your to-do list, you know, think about the VOG, or domestic abuse strategies. The government will be consulting on those very soon. That will include a public survey, so making sure to get that out to your networks and to the public, and engage in those strategy discussions so that you can talk about these aspects of financial abuse or economic abuse that you're seeing in your work, the struggles that you might feel you're having to really get to where you want to be. These are the kinds of messages we need to communicate to government, because they'll be making strategic decisions about where funding will go, where they will put their energy. And these are the kinds of opportunities that really make an impact at the national level for that. There's also strategic guidance that will run alongside the domestic abuse bill. And that's a really great opportunity. Again, I know, I would just say some of the organizations you've heard from today, C and others, will be right in there trying to get the very best of information to government about that. But anything you can do to really enhance that is important. And of course, we're entering into soon our 16 days of action for the UN elimination of violence against women and girls. And there's a lot we can all do individually. The incredible guidance you just saw Judy have on her screen. There's some really great COVID related guidance for financial economic abuse, but also for friends, family, social networks. Be great if we could all take a look at those, make sure our colleagues know about these resources, talk about what you've heard today, log on to the incredible series of webinars coming up. I know I sent the list to my own staff team, and somebody wrote back and said, I've just signed up for all of them. Because so you've got really great opportunities ahead to engage, make sure others do in your networks. And so I will draw it to a close. I'm glad I've been able to introduce myself to you. Please be in touch with my office or through organizations like C, communicating about this issue and what you would like me to do. You'll have my absolute support every step of the way, as Nicola and hopefully the team and presenters know. And I'm just glad to have been able to say a quick hello before you launch into some final Q&A. So thanks so much, Nicola, for having me. Thanks for all of you for all of your incredible work. I'm really inspired. You've put me in a great mood on a Friday, knowing that these things are happening and knowing we're in such good hands with this kind of expertise. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Nicole. I should also say it's Nicole's official day off. She really does go above and beyond to support the work of the violence against women and girls sector, and we will always be grateful for that. Just to say, one of the comments was that, you know, it's a shame in some ways that we have to rely on charities to support victims and survivors, when really the government needs to be doing more. And certainly I'd want to echo Nicole's point around the no recourse to public funds issue. I know it's really difficult, and we would really want this domestic abuse bill, if it is going to be the landmark bill, certainly the former Prime Minister talked of, Theresa May, then it needs to support all women, and economic safety, as we've spoken about, really can underpin physical safety. So it's vitally important that migrant women have access to benefits and so on and so forth too, including refuge accommodation. So I'm going to ask all of the panellists to come back on screen and start to address some of the questions that have been asked throughout the webinar today. Whilst I do so, those of you who have been following us on Twitter will have seen that with 360 plus of you, I have to admit that even though I can't see all of you, I have been a slightly nervous chair this morning. And I omitted to mention at the very beginning, when I talked about the Economic Justice Project, that we were supported by Olu Adisa, who is a senior researcher, Dr. Olu Adisa, who's a senior researcher at the University of Suffolk, in relation to the evaluation, and also DMSS Research and Davis Associates. So, you know, this has been a collective effort, and we're hugely grateful for the support and the learning that we've been referring to in terms of the recommendations that have come out of this. So I just wanted to make that point. And similarly, whilst we are gearing up to the 16 days of activism, it is also Talk Money Week. So I would encourage people to get engaged with the Talk Money campaign, which is happening this week as well. We've talked very much about how we're bringing these two sectors together. Certainly we're exhausted every November because we have about at least 3 weeks of activity where we're running around talking money and talking about violence against women and girls. But it's just so important because there's such a taboo. As a society, we don't talk about money, and we certainly don't talk about abuse. So maybe that's one of the reasons why we don't talk so much about economic abuse. Okay, so I've been making some notes here in terms of the questions that are being asked of us. So what I'm going to do is read the questions and then suggest somebody on the panel to respond to that question. If anyone else on the panel does want to come in, please just let me know. So the first question is in relation to the legal system. Why are solicitors and barristers not interested about money that's being hidden by the abuser in divorce proceedings? And why are courts not more aware of the issue of economic abuse? So perhaps I could ask Karen to answer that first question, please, Karen.
Hi, I think the issue around sort of legal proceedings is that it's not raised. So when you go through proceedings for financial settlement, or you go through proceedings for child maintenance or some such proceedings like that, we deal with, especially where domestic abuse is concerned, we deal with lots of other issues. We look at the risk, we look at the abuse that's happened, but often the issues around debt is not addressed. So it's not part of that discussion. So I think it just needs to be brought to the forefront and be part of that discussion, because it does have a massive impact on someone being able to move forward safely, and to be able to take control of their life. So I think it actually needs to be part of that initial discussion with solicitors and barristers when they're supporting someone who has experienced domestic abuse. And equally, like we discuss around physical violence, we need to discuss around the financial situation, and not just about a financial settlement. But equally, we need to be able to go back, and when those financial settlements are in place, if payments not being made, we need to be able to quickly go back and make sure those payments are made, because actually the ability for someone to be safe, to move forward and have control in their life is reliant on those payments.
Lovely, thanks so much, Karen. Just the fact that there is a recommendation around increased awareness of family legal professionals as part of the Economic Justice Project. And I would also flag that Surviving Economic Abuse, we've just produced some resources for family solicitors as well. So if you are working in the legal profession, or think that people that you're working with in the legal profession need to know more about this, please do contact us, because we talk about how economic abuse can be recognised within financial law, family law proceedings. So the next question we have is somebody asking about certain behaviours. Are they economic abuse? So Judy, I'm going to turn to you if that's okay on this one. So the person asks, is hiding how much someone is earning, perhaps spending thousands of pounds on themselves and very little on their partner, economic abuse?
I would say potentially. It depends on the overall context, and when we do training with professionals, often one of the exercises we start with are examples of behaviour, and we ask the trainees to say, is this abuse or not, or is it, or would we need more information? And often it depends on the context, and if there's that sort of overall environment of fear and control. Certainly hiding information is a perpetrator tactic, and sometimes perpetrators won't actively take money from the survivor, but they will absorb the household income by spending it on themselves or on other things. So then the survivor is forced to use any surplus money that she has to support herself and the household, and perhaps go into debt to do that. So I would say potentially yes, although obviously it does depend on context.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Judy. So the next question I'm going to come to first to Jen, and then I'm going to ask Helen, because I think she'll have some insight into this one as well. So Jen, how many cases do you know of that involve gambling of some sort?
I would say it's a small percentage, but the perpetrators often do gamble, drink and take drugs, and the victim survivor is often left with no money because that's what it's taken to be used for. They don't often have evidence of this, they just know it's going on, and they'll drain their bank accounts and all their wages to pay for their gambling habits. But it's not a major issue that crops up time and time again. It's a smaller issue, I've found.
Thanks, Jeanette. I don't know, Helen, if you want to add to that at all? I know you work across a range of vulnerabilities at StepChange.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. I would agree with Jen. It's not a massive percentage, but it is certainly it's something that we do see from time to time at StepChange. Gambling, again, is one of those other taboos, another vulnerability that's often not talked about. It's often not brought up in conversation, and we will often only find out about it much later down the line, such as when we're asking for evidence of bank accounts, when we're looking at setting up plans, for example, and that's when we identify that there's a lot of gambling transactions. So it is a known problem. It is hidden, and it's also can be a difficult one to deal with in terms of looking at debt solutions, because gambling is often viewed differently as a cause of debt, and creditors can often treat it differently to other reasons cited for debt.
Thanks, Helen. And I think this just really highlights how many issues there are across the vulnerable customer piece, and what we need to be doing to address them all, but also recognise the interlinkages between them. And I would also just kind of add that GamCare is doing quite a lot of work around women who are affected by gambling. Certainly I have their most recent report on my reading list. So I would advise people who are interested in this area perhaps to have a look at that as well. The next question is in relation to coerced mortgages. And whether or not that is something that we see. Again, Jeanette, can I come back and ask you about that, please?
So there are some women that have been made to take out a mortgage or get a mortgage put into joint names for their benefit, so to sell their former home and then engage in a new mortgage jointly, so that they then relinquish some of their assets to the perpetrator further down the line. It tends to be more where women have suffered with their property, where the perpetrators moved in and then wants beneficial interest out of that property. That's what I'm finding.
Lovely, thanks, Jeanette. Again, also to flag that in October 2018, UK Finance, which is the new name for the British Bankers Association, and who works with banks and building societies, introduced a code of practice around financial abuse and how they should respond. And we've been funded by the Home Office for the last 2 years to support banks and building societies implement that code. And certainly now within customer vulnerability teams at Lloyds Banking Group, there is now a specialist domestic and financial abuse team, which has moved into the space of considering coerced mortgages, and certainly perpetrators who won't agree to change the rate of interest, for example, the fixed interest rate or other terms related to a joint mortgage specifically. So it feels as if there is some movement in that area, which is fantastic. And I think that would cover off a question that someone asked about training to bank staff. We've been training banks and building societies across the piece. We work very closely with Save Lives in relation to their relationship with NatWest Group. We bring expertise to that. And certainly we're working in a more coordinated way with Refuge around its banking relationship with the cooperative bank as well. So I think, again, working across the domestic abuse sector and with financial institutions, we're starting to see real change in that space. And as Judy's already referenced, we do have a webinar specific on our banking work coming up. So please do look at that if you'd like to attend it. I also want to move now immediately just to a question in relation to male victims. There's been a lot of questions about whether or not Money Advice Plus responds to them as part of the partnership. So again, Karen, can I come to you for that, please?
Absolutely. So we do support male victims. It's very much reliant, I will be fair and say it's very much reliant on who funds us. But Money Advice Plus has set aside their own money to support male victims as well, to make sure that that happens. So yes, we will support everybody in that service.
And could you just give an indication of how many male victims you have supported?
To be fair, we don't have many. I think we've had sort of 4 or 5 over the last year. But I think that's equally because we don't advertise our service very much. So I think there's around that, there's about our advertisement, because we are heavily oversubscribed into our service, both for our casework service and the financial support line. So equally, we don't really do any advertising of our service. So we don't go out and say that we're there. So I guess the more people get to know us, the more people will try and access our service.
Lovely, thanks, Karen. And just to flag as well that we are working with Respect, which provides the national helpline for male survivors of domestic abuse. And we're currently working with them to adapt some of our resources to reflect the particular needs of male victims. And certainly we were in conversation with the University of Durham about some new research around the experiences of male victims this week as well. So I would say do keep an eye on our resources because we will be providing space within the Surviving Economic Abuse website to respond to the needs of male victims going forward. Just out of quick interest, Helen, is that any different in terms of the response to domestic abuse at StepChange?
I'm afraid, Nicola, I don't have any stats on the male versus female breakdown. I do know that more females overall come to our service than males. It's slightly more weighted towards females than males.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the research that I'm aware of shows consistently that whilst men do experience economic abuse, absolutely, because they generally have access to more economic resources, it tends to be kind of single incidents and they're able to kind of move on within 6 months, where certainly women, we understand economic abuse more in the kind of context of power and control. That's not to say that that doesn't happen to men, but women disproportionately so because of the inequality that they experience. And certainly they'll be with a partner for many years before they have the economic resource they need to leave. So there are issues here about, addressing inequality, whether that be gender or race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, age, disability. It's a really complex picture, and over the next few years, we really want to understand that and be able to respond to the specific needs of victims and survivors with different identities in more detail. We have another question about consequences for perpetrators. Again, Judy, do you think I could, actually, I don't know, I can come to you, Judy, but I'm just wondering, Nicole, I don't know if you're still on the panel. I can't see you on my screen. So if you are and want to jump in.
Sure.
You are lovely. About how we might have a criminal justice response to perpetrators of economic abuse.
I think that's a really excellent point in terms of understanding what it is that, somebody was asking about lawyers being involved, and but I do think a lot of this comes down to the confidence within investigating officers or frontline police officers to understand what it is that they would do, how they would collect that information, how that's presented. I think that is a huge area where we could do so much better, obviously. And I think that, again, in a lot of ways comes down to prioritizing and helping be clear on what would be the possibilities of the kinds of things they collect, what would they then do with that. There's a lot of training involved. And I know Nicola's been doing some work with the DA Matters training, which is really one way or one example of excellent training that gets the frontline police officers to understand the range of coercion and control. So I think there's a lot to do just practically on that issue, but also obviously from my point of view as the commissioner, to help raise that awareness within the Home Office, MOJ and others, police transformation funds, really to make sure that we could be more assertive about how do we really put the resource and investment in to get that done, and also ask about, can we start to monitor, understand, by crime type, or charging what's exactly happening. So I'm really aware that that's a role that I could help play in doing that.
That's really helpful, Nicole, and thank you for speaking to the the training we've been doing with Safe Lives around the DA Matters programme. So we have a specific workshop now, which is led by Jasmine Decour on the economic abuse team, surviving economic abuse team around that. And we have the evaluation on our website if anyone would like to see it. I would also flag that we do monitor successful prosecutions of the coercive and controlling behaviour legislation. And we found that 6 in 10 of successful prosecutions include at least one element of economic abuse, which I think all lends itself to the importance of ensuring that this form of abuse is also something that can be prosecuted post-separation as well. There are some more practical questions that have been asked, and what we're going to do is respond to all of those questions via a blog on our website. So I'm really sorry that we've not been able to answer all the questions today, but we absolutely promise to take them all away with us. So do keep an eye on our website. We'll let you know when that further information is there. But we just wanted to spend the last couple of minutes of today's webinar just talking a little bit about how you might want to get involved in the work of surviving economic abuse. So Becky, if you just want to go forward 2 slides for me, please, just because we are in the middle of a bit of a wellbeing challenge here at Surviving Economic Abuse at the moment. I think we're all feeling, the effects of lockdown number 2 and certainly the colder and darker evenings and the need to really get out at this time. Certainly I know that the cases that a lot of people are responding to at the moment are a lot more complex. It's taking, you know, much longer to be able to support victims and survivors because of an increased emotional support need at the moment, and also the importance of making sure that team members are well looked after. So as a team and alongside Money Advice Plus, we are currently in the middle of a challenge. We're walking 20 million steps, would you believe, to Australia between now and the end of March. We reckon if we do 10,000 a day each, we should get there by then. But if you did want to raise awareness of economic abuse, we've got lots of social media activity around this. You can go to our website. Again, we'll share the presentation slides, which gives you a link to the hyperlink that will be shown there. You know, so please do join us. For a small registration fee, you can help us get to Australia a lot quicker, which would be fantastic. I also want to acknowledge that we do have Australian colleagues on today's webinar, which is fantastic. I can't even imagine what time of night it must be for you. So we really are thankful that you've taken part in this. And the reason that we are walking to Australia is because as part of the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust Travelling Fellowship that I undertook in 2016, it was at that moment when I saw the response to victims and survivors of economic abuse in the state of Victoria, where a Royal Commission around family violence had just taken place and specific recommendations were made around economic abuse, that I felt that's what we needed in the UK. So we're kind of visiting 4 years after that kind of moment where we felt that it was really important that women in the UK had that same response. So thanks so much, you know, to the international and the best practice. I should also say the whole Economic Justice Project was similarly motivated by practice that I saw in America as part of that work, and we've been supported by American academics. And that screening tool is an academic tool, and we've been collecting comparative data to see whether women's experiences of economic abuse are the same as they are in Australia. So we really are, whilst national in scope, kind of global in terms of perspective. If we just move to the next slide, we would made reference to a number of other webinars that we've got coming up. So we're really excited over the next few months up until the 16th of December. We're going to be talking about issues in relation to privately owned housing specifically, so in relation to mortgages, but also we will touch on economic abuse across all other tenures for those who work in that space. So we're looking forward to that. We talked about the banking one quite a lot. I would recommend, because there's a lot going on in that space, that you attend that if you're interested. We've also, via funding from the Standard Life Foundation, now been able to undertake an economic safety survey, rapid review. So the needs of victims and survivors specifically around economic abuse and COVID will be discussed at that webinar. We'll also be talking more to the police piece in partnership with Safe Lives, and similarly leading a webinar on children, because this is probably one of the kind of least understood aspects of how economic abuse impacts children within that context of coercion and control as well. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide now. I think I'm bang on 12. I feel like the last few hours have absolutely flown by. Thank you everybody so much for attending today's webinar. I think through the question and answer session and through the comments that I've been seeing, I think we've all got something out of today's webinar. So I'd just like to thank you very much again. There are our contact details, and please do be in touch. We would absolutely love to hear from you. Thank you very much indeed.